Hi there. My name is Scott Larson, and I am the creator and writer and illustrator of the comic book series Visitations. Visitations is the history of Chicago as seen through the eyes of the residents of the city's oldest cemetery. If you'd like to read a copy of issue number 1 of Visitations, I do give out free digital copies. And you can get that by emailing me at the email below. It's visitationscomicbook@gmail.com and just say, hey, I'd like a free issue of Visitations. I'd be happy to send it to you. I want to tell you a little story. When I was growing up, I had always decided that I was going to get into the comic book business, even when I was a little kid. And one of the things that I found in growing up in the 1980s was we would get comic books, and there were a lot of times when they would have different text pieces. And when I was 15, I picked this up. It was Marvel Saga, and it was issue number 3. And the text piece at the beginning was written by the editor, Danny Fingeroth. Now, I knew who Danny Fingeroth was. He had been the writer on Web of Spider-Man. He had been the editor of all the Spider-Man titles before that. And since he wrote that text piece, and what the text piece was really interesting, because what it did was it talked about how the first issue he found where he wanted to go into comics, or the comic books that he loved, was Fantastic Four number 4, which was actually covered in that particular issue of Marvel Saga. And so when I read that, I realized, hey, he was like me. He was just a fan. He saw this and he really wanted to pursue it. And there he was in the business itself. And I've watched Danny's career as the years have gone on, and he was an editor when I first found him. Then he was a writer, and he did some more editing while he was writing, and then he left Marvel and he started doing stuff for Right Now. And I picked this book up for him. It is How to Create Comics, and he wrote it, and Mike Manley did the artwork for it. And he's also he's done a lot of teaching over the years. And the thing that's really interesting about him is he's gone from editor to writer to teacher and to comics historian. He's been doing a lot of different comic book things in the history of comic book things for a while now. One of the things he does is he hosts Will Eisner Week in New York, and that's coming up really, really soon. He's going to talk a little bit about that. And he's also participating in this thing on Monday night at 8 p.m. Eastern called Talent Talk Live. And he'll talk a little bit about that as well. But the thing that he's really excited about right now is he wrote a couple of years ago, he wrote a book about Stan Lee's life. It came out about a year ago, I want to say. And he had done it. He was working on it before Stan Lee had actually passed away. And then it came out about a year afterwards. And it's called A Marvelous Life, The Amazing Story of Stan Lee. And so he's going to talk a little bit about that. But more than any of that, he's going to talk about himself and the journey that he took, how he started, where he went to, and how he got from where he is. So I'm going to bring Danny on, and I'm going to ask him to unmute himself.
I'm unmuted.
Yeah, hi, how are you? And if you could start your video.
Oh, yeah. Oh, there I am.
There you are. Hi, how are you?
Hi, Scott. So I have to ask you a big favor.
Sure.
Stop stalking me. You know too much about me. This is creepy.
You know what? The thing that's funny is how do I want to put this? You turn up all over the place. And I listened to a lot of audiobooks, and I had listened to the Stan Lee book that came out about a year ago. But there was a book that was called Hey Kids Comics, and it was about different people being interviewed about their fan days. And there was Danny Fingeroth. And so I'm not stalking you. You're more stalking me because I can't get away from you. You're everywhere.
Well, it's true. It's true. I'm a big publicity hound. I've never heard of this book you just mentioned, Hey Kids Comics, and I'm in it?
I believe you are in it. It's an audio book.
Yeah.
And actually, while we're talking, I'll find it here. I don't want to be looking at my phone while I'm talking to you. But before I let you go, I'll find it for you. Okay. But yeah, I believe there's a piece in there by you.
Okay, it's quite possible. It's been a long career. And this is the Stan Lee book, which, because of my fancy Zoom background, I lift it too high, it disappears. Like I'm either in Doctor Strange's Sanctum Sanctorum or in the Spirits Wildwood Cemetery headquarters. I'm never sure. But yeah, this is A Marvelous Life: The Amazing Story of Stan Lee. Um, and yeah, you're right. The book came out November of 2019, but I've been working on it for years, and I have some of the last interviews anybody's done with Stan, I believe. And then the paperback just came out this fall, and as you said, the audiobook is also available through the usual sources. So
And you narrate the audiobook
I
yourself.
narrate the whole audiobook. Yeah, that was a very interesting experience. It was and I've had compliments on it. I didn't know what it would be like doing that. I'm hoping to go back and do the audiobooks on some of my previous books, Superman on the Couch and Disguised as Clark Kent, because people have asked me to do those, and the rights to those are reverted. But we're getting way ahead of ourselves. So,
So so what
okay.
was the first comic book property you came across? Did you see a TV show, or did you see any of the old serials,
I mean, as a
or
kid,
what's I'm sorry?
as a child,
Yes.
okay, because I wasn't really thinking when I was 4 and 5 years old. I wasn't really using the word property to refer to to the
Oh,
to the media I was that I was experiencing. Um, wait, I'm trying to adjust my own frame here. Um, the story as Stan used to say, I've told this story so many times it might even be true. The thing that I remember making a big impression on me. By the way, if you hear rattling in the background, it's because it's authentic New York apartment radiator rattling. So I
oh,
hope you can't hear it, but if you do, that's what it is. I remember being a fan of the Popeye the Sailor cartoons and of Popeye. I think I remember going to like some costume parties as a kid. My mother would draw anchor tattoos on my forearms, and so I think from there I went to Popeye comic books, which opened the world of comics, and I think we got the New York papers, most notably the pre-Rupert Murdoch New York Post, which had uh, a robust color comics on the weekend and black and white. But Popeye always struck me as the thing that sort of drew me in. And then I was a fairly early reader. I was reading by the time I was about 5, largely thanks to comics, actually. And then I had a cousin. My cousin Steve Pizer was a comics fan, and I think he would give me, when he saw that I liked them, he used to give me lots of comics. I remember him giving me like Superboy comics, Superboy and Adventure comics. So those are my memories of that, and then of course, once you're a comic reader as a kid, our tribe has a way of finding others in our group who are also into it. So there were always a few kids that I went to elementary school with who were aspiring comics professionals, and I'm just the right age. I'm of the dreaded baby boom generation, so
mhm.
I was the perfect age to be caught in the first wave of the Marvel revolution of the early '60s. I was there, buying and reading those comics.
So, well, we've already mentioned it, or I've already mentioned it. Fantastic Four #4. Um, so tell that story. I mean, I told a little bit of it, but not really.
I guess I've been reading comics since I was 5, right? So maybe when I'm 8 or 9, somewhere in there, a classmate of mine, one of my 3 or 4 peers who were into comics, says there's this new thing. I want to credit it to a guy named Mark Eden. He says there's this new thing called the Fantastic Four, and it's really great. So I went to my local candy store, which also was where kids in New York bought magazines and egg creams and baseball cards and everything else. Um, and the first issue that I saw was Fantastic Four #4. That was the first Marvel superhero comic that I consciously bought, and it was, I was pretty. I thought of myself as an expert. I guess I've been reading. I love superheroes. That was always my genre. I knew there were other genres, um, but the only one, actually, there were two that really interested me. Two and a half superheroes. A little bit of like military humor, like Sad Sack, although not war comics per se, but and then unknown to me that it was a Marvel comic. Somehow I like Millie the Model. I think they had it in my barber shop where they give kids comics to read. And of course, no kid is going to give away the comics they really prize, like their Fantastic Fours. But, somehow you'll find Millie the Model. And of course, what I didn't know was that Millie was written by Stan Lee and drawn by Stan Goldberg. And, and, uh, um, and it had that Stan Lee humor. Those stories, out of as lighthearted as they were, always had some ironic thing happening and some funny thing. Um, and by the way, are we recording on YouTube? Is this
Yeah.
automatically recorded?
Hold on.
Did we
No,
forget?
it's there.
Okay, good. All right, good. All right.
Yep.
Okay. Because on Zoom, it usually will say you're being recorded, but okay.
Oh yeah, it says it. It says it on mine.
Okay, good. As long as one of us is.
Yes.
Sorry. Um, so I didn't know. I've been kind of reading Stan Lee comics, and Marvel comics even then. But FF number 4, and then New York was a pretty good market for comics distribution. But something about that comic was just so different from all the DC superhero comics. All the things that everybody talks about. That they squabbled. That issue, it opens up, continuing from the previous issue, which was disorienting because everything at DC was done in one.
Mhm.
So it opens up the FF. They're yelling at each other. This Johnny Torch is just, pardon the expression, stormed off. Pardon the pun, but after having an argument with the Thing, and that one, you never saw that, like people in real life having fights with their friends and relatives. And then the Submariner shows up, and even though I'd never heard of, this was Stan's genius, really, right? One of Stan's geniuses. Uh, the Submariner shows up. I never heard of the Submariner, and yet I knew that the Submariner coming back was the most important thing that had ever happened in my entire life until Captain America came back. And then Captain America, who I'd also never heard of coming back, was also the most important thing that ever happened in my entire life. Somehow I knew that, and Stan knew how to convey that to kids. And that was really the beginning of me outgrowing at age 9 DC Comics. And of being hypnotized by this Marvel approach, and of course by Jack Kirby's art, which I think that was a little below my radar. Not really. I take that, erase that. But I mean, the art and the script and the plots, and of course the coloring. Marvel had this kind of darker palette. And I think they literally used cheaper paper and cheaper ink. Even though they were printed, I think at the same printers, I think the production values were coarser and rougher and just sort of more organic I don't know if that's the word, but there was something about it that really hit you in the face in a way that the DC comics didn't for me. I was just in the perfect spot. And if you look at the people who worked at Marvel, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, there were a lot of people born within like a year either way of me. I mean, that for comics fans and then comics fans who would become pros, there was something about being part of that period at Marvel's and Stan and Jax and Steve Ditko and Larry Lieber's development that was just magical.
I have a question. Now you were talking, and this is more of a fan question, and not
Okay.
about you, but from
How
one.
dare you not talk about me? Okay, what's the question?
And then we'll go back to other questions I have for you. So you mentioned that the Submariner and Captain America coming back were like the biggest thing ever. Were you reading DC when they brought the Golden Age flashback and the Justice Society back?
Yeah, and well, yeah,
Okay.
but when you look at your calendar, in life, there's a lot of things, especially when you're young, that
Uh-huh.
that in retrospect you think those must have taken 10 years, and then you realize they all happened within 6 months.
Sure.
Well, Flash of Two Worlds came out the same year as Fantastic Four '1. you
Mhm.
know,
Mhm.
Fantastic Four '1 wasn't on my radar yet, but that's those both 1961 comics. Yeah, that was a big thing for me. So that's true. I had been primed by Julie Schwartz and Gardner Fox and Carmine Infantino but obviously I was the kind of kid for whom that was important. I mean yeah. But you're right. That was definitely part of, and I guess that's part of the whole legend of Martin Goodman noticing that DC's superhero comics are doing well and telling Stan we need to have some of our own. Um, and so Stan doing his version. Plus Stan, I think Stan's sensibility was informed by his being in touch with people like Roy Thomas and Jerry Bales, who I think were sort of, pointing out to him how fans were responding. Because that was I mean, comics superhero comics are a relatively new medium. So there was no, everybody always thought, from the beginning, well, this will be read by kids or GIs and nobody's going to read them for more than 2 years. Suddenly it's 20 years later and these adults with
Right.
adults with PhDs are writing to Stan and telling him, hey, DC brought back these people, why don't you bring back your line? So I mean, there's a lot of different, success has multiple parents and
Mhm.
failure has none, and that whole thing. So I think all those things came together, and I mean, I don't know how my friend who told me about Fantastic Four first heard about it himself, but I mean, it was all, if you went into any newsstand or candy store or drugstore in the New York area, that stuff, there were always comics. You didn't know what the hell they were, or who was buying them, who was reading them. They just, and Marvel especially had no brand identity at all. It had a little IMD and a little Atlas, but it didn't have that brand identity that DC or even Carlton had. So I remember there being a lot of comics that just seemed mysterious. It would be like you go to the supermarket and you want, Wise potato chips, which was the brand that, I mean, you want the brand. And then there's
Mhm.
other things that serve the same function and maybe they're a little cheaper, but you don't know what they really are. So look, obviously Marvel and Timely Atlas Marvel been putting out comics for literally for decades, but they didn't have that. They were just sort of these weird no name branding things, and they hadn't put out superheroes since since the 50s. So yeah, it was, but you're right, it was it was a trend, uh or at least imitating what DC was doing.
Well, I think that, and this is going off topic a little bit. I
God
think
forbid.
that the generational aspect, and it's something that DC has kept up over the years, but I think that reflected in part your generation as kids and the World War II generation. Those guys were the heroes, and so seeing them coming back as heroes probably like triggered something as well.
I you know I'm not sure. I mean, um I think it had to. I don't know. I mean, there was something. There was a certain. I wonder what was going on in television at the time, because I bet there was something going on in terms of the TV I was watching, that maybe there was a certain nostalgia for.
Mhm.
Everybody always says, "Oh, if you put out this comic that refers to a story that happened before your readers were born, they won't respond to it." But that's totally not true. If you do it right in any pop culture field, I mean, you can. It's easy to make, because kids are intensely curious about what happened before they were born. What were my parents like? When they met and when they were children, and we're very curious. At least some of us are, about all this stuff that happened before. And so the idea that there's this world of comics and world of superheroes and these complex mythologies, for the right kind of kid is not only not daunting, it's addicting. It's, I mean, it's, I guess in a way it relates, a million years later to my interest in comics and other cultural and pop culture history. And I can tell you a little bit about some other stuff I'm involved in. And it has to do with my interest in Will Eisner, which was brought about, really stimulated by Jules Feiffer's book, The Great Comic Book Heroes, which did reprint some adventures of Submariner and the Torch and Captain America, and especially the Spirit. So that again tapped into this interest of what came before in these media. And look, I myself, if it's not known or plain, I am a native New Yorker, descended from Eastern European Jewish refugees,
Mhm.
just like a lot of the guys who created the superheroes. So that was sort of fascinating to me. Like, well, that's interesting. While my grandparents and aunts and uncles and parents were doing whatever they were doing, in Manhattan and the Bronx and Brooklyn, these guys whose work I so admire were really literally going to the same high schools,
Mhm.
and it, so the idea that, that literally made it personal for me was, oh, that's interesting. I have a lot in common with these guys, and yet they became comic book people. They became comic book creators when that was not considered like a highly reputable thing to do. I wonder what was different in their lives and their sensibilities. So for me, it tied in, there was a personal connection as well, even if I didn't, even if it took a while for me to be able to articulate that, because it's just another part of it which goes like, oh, Spider-Man's cool, and there's, the FF are cool. But the advent of the Marvel heroes combined with a cash flow problem. I mean, at 12 cents each, there's a limit to how many of those things you can buy every month. So at a certain point, I literally said, in the kid economy, as I know it, I cannot afford to buy all the Marvel and all the DC superhero comics. And so at a certain point, I just said, I like the Marvel, the DCs are not, don't seem to me as compelling. And I just went cold turkey with them then.
Real quick comment about that. When I found you guys, as you were editing Spider-Man when I found Spider-Man, and I had been buying DC, I'd been buying Star Wars, and I started buying Spider-Man when he got the black suit. And when and I'm going along, and all of a sudden I'm getting all the other Marvel books, because Secret Wars was a gigantic, like, all it did was just tuned you into everybody else. But I remember that December of 1985 when Web of Spider-Man #1 is coming out, and it was 65 cents instead of 60 cents. And DC was 75 cents at the time. And I remember my friends and I talking, it's like, where are we going to get this extra nickel? But you can't not buy Web of Spider-Man #1, you know? So what made you decide to become a writer? I mean, where did that come from? I obviously we know where it came from, but how did that evolve from you reading comics? When you went to school, did you decide, I'm going to be a writer, I'm going to be doing novels? Am I, like Stan Lee always wanted to do the great American novel, right?
You know, I mean, that's, as you may have noticed, much of our lives, the reason we like fiction is because fiction has a structure and a beginning and a middle and an end, and turning points and clearly defined conflicts and good guys and bad guys. Actual life is quite a bit more chaotic than that. So I can kind of look back now and go, oh, here's why I did X, Y, or Z. Let me I'll sort of jump. You know, I once, at one of the periods when I was the editor of Spider-Man, and of course working with Tom DeFalco, had been the editor before me and wrote tons and tons of Spider-Man. I said, Tom, Peter Parker sometimes says he's Spider-Man because of what happened with Uncle Ben getting murdered and he thought it was his fault. He sometimes says he does it because great power necessitates great responsibility. Sometimes says he does it because it's fun to be Spider-Man. He sometimes says he does it because he needs to earn money to help support his aunt. He has 100 different reasons. And Tom said, yeah, he doesn't have a clue. And what he meant was he's like a real person, right? We all think we know why we do what we do, but it's really only in retrospect very often that we understand why or can actually fit a motivation to it. So I appreciate your curiosity about me, and I had always been a creative kid. Of course, every kid is creative. Every kid draws, every kid writes, every kid dances. But it was, for me, it was a passion, drawing, and especially drawing superheroes and baseball players. I took that, they're looking for people who like to draw course. I didn't take the course, but I took the test, and I ended up not taking the course. But believe it or not, they believed that they told me, and they sent a salesman to my house, that I was good enough to take the famous artist course. I don't know if they ever rejected anybody. And the irony, of course, was I grew up literally in Manhattan, on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. So within walking distance of my house were probably 10 world-class art schools. But I'm like, no, I have to take the famous artist course, which I've heard is a very good course. People say very good things about it. So I wanted to be Jack Kirby, because every kid who loves comics and superheroes wants to be Jack Kirby, because what Stan Lee does is a little more mysterious. He's the writer, he's the editor. What we kind of know, but Kirby was the more glamour guy, even though, and again, we go, oh, well, Stan was the Hollywood guy and Jack was the more down to earth. But it was the idea of being Jack Kirby. We knew nothing about money or credit or ownership. It was just like, here's this guy, Jack Kirby, drawing this cool. So I always drew. When any project in elementary school needed somebody to draw something, I was one of the two or three people who would draw it. And then along with that, I started writing too, short stories and poems. And so I was always involved in creative stuff. And I knew that was an interest. And I went to a film school that kind of specialized in film as art as opposed to film as a commercial enterprise. But again, a lot of this stuff somebody once, I wouldn't say it was random, but I sort of felt my way through things. I had no big master plan. I knew it was unlikely that I was gonna, be doctor, lawyer, accountant, traditional profession kind of thing. And for numerous reasons, I was just pissed off at the world, much as I still am, despite my pacific demeanor. And so I graduated with a degree in cinema, in filmmaking, but not from an NYU or a UCLA, from a very highly regarded state university, SUNY of Binghamton, which had this film school that was staffed by these brilliant avant-garde filmmakers. Ken Jacobs and Larry Gottheim were probably the best known. Local Chicago guy you might know is Saul Levine. Stan Brakhage was probably the most well-known of that movement of a non-narrative, for the most part, film. And I didn't think to myself then, oh, gee, even the most famous of these guys is like barnstorming to colleges because they need to do that to make a living because they're making fine art. So they're not getting rich on their fine art. Anyway, it was a great education, very interesting. Art Spiegelman is a product of that school. Ken Jacobs was his mentor, and um, um, some other people. I guess in terms of this audience for this podcast, probably Spiegelman is probably the best known people who attended that same program several years before I did. So I get out of college and come back home like every kid does, except for me, home was Manhattan. So here I am, which of course, as a native Manhattanite, my one desire was to get the hell out of Manhattan and never look back.
How every kid feels.
Right. So, but I was there, and I had stopped reading superhero comics, Marvel comics on a regular basis back in high school. I remember being very excited when Kirby went to DC, and reading those fourth world books, and having kind of mixed feelings about them, like a lot of people did. You could feel the power, but then they kind of looked and felt something like Marvel, but something was missing, which turned out was Stan Lee. But they still had their intensity and power of their own. It was Jack friggin' Kirby. So I thought, it might be interesting. Here's the thing that I find interesting. You may not, but we're talking about me. So I said to myself, it might be fun. I had some office jobs, I had some office temp jobs. I did all sorts of weird, I did some like negative matching on porn films, which is not as exciting as it sounds, because I had this film training.
Mhm.
Did some industrial film stuff, just some office temp, and I didn't want to go to grad school at that point. Although oddly enough, my career now is basically that of an English major. So I thought, it might be fun to work at Marvel Comics, and I had a connection that could get me in there, in the door, for an informational tour, which is what I went on. And then I ran, and I ran into somebody I'd gone to high school who was working there, and later on, he went freelance. So, but it's funny because I never said to myself it might be fun to work at DC Comics.
Right.
No offense, it just didn't strike me. It just basically it came at that point in my life. I thought I might want to be in the restaurant business because I like cooking, and I'd worked at a couple of restaurants, and of course, I was trying to figure out some way to make some money in film without moving to California. And then, gee, it might be fun to work with Marvel Comics. I ended up there. And so, on the one hand, it has a certain randomness to it, but I guess I look back and I think the randomness in my life was in defined parameters. So, even though I wasn't always sure exactly, I knew the general guardrails of what it was that I thought I had some talent in and what I found interesting, and comics was among them.
I think that's really fascinating, and I had no clue. If I'm stalking you, I'm not doing a very good job because I had no clue you went to film school. And I think I think it's really interesting, and stuff like that is one of the reasons why I'm doing this, because there's little things that people learn along the way. And I'm sure that you starting over at Marvel, even with a film school background, probably didn't hurt you at all, or handicap you as you were going through. So you started working there as what? Did you start? I do know that you're an assistant editor on the Indiana Jones comics.
That's way later.
Okay, all right. So tell the story.
Well, I started there as the assistant editor slash production manager uh, in Marvel's British department, which was one reason it was a good entry level job, because we were mostly doing reprint material. There was some new material with Captain Britain and new covers, and we broke the stories up into chapters so there'd be new splash pages. So we prepared publication for these weekly comics in England. That was a market, or the market in England, and it was weekly anthology comics, like 2000 AD started around that time. But it started in that format, is my understanding, because the United Kingdom had a tradition of comics like that, and Marvel had a presence. I mean, the real hardcore fans just wanted the American color Marvel comics, but for just little kids who just wanted the stories, it was these black and white anthology titles. So, and Larry Lieber had come back from Atlas Comics, which was Martin Goodman's rival venture. And Larry had come back, I think, a year or so before, and he was the editor. He was the American editor of the British titles, and I was his assistant. So that was my first job in comics and at Marvel.
Sorry,
Huh?
can I ask what year that was?
That was 1977.
Okay.
So I had also gotten a job offer to train to be a chef in a midtown Manhattan restaurant, because as I said, I was interested in cooking and the restaurant business. Even though my dad was in the banquet catering business, that didn't stop me. And So I literally one day had to choose Fiorello's restaurant or Marvel Comics, and ultimately I thought there'd be less boiling grease involved at Marvel Comics, so I went with that job offer. You
Were
know,
you right?
I think so.
Okay.
I think you know, yeah. I mean, it's fun. I have a friend that I went to high school with named David Waltock, who started a restaurant called Chanterelle, which was like a mainstay in Soho for decades and one of the more famous restaurants of the modern era. And you know, I think he was the right guy for that. I don't think I would have been the right person for you know, to make my career out of restaurants and food, as much as I admire what David did, you know. So yeah, I think I made the right choice.
Okay. So, so you were doing that, and then you moved up to the American Color Comics.
Well, I was in, you know, Marvel. Once you're in there,
Mhm.
you know, I mean, kind of this will kind of tie into the story later, assuming you have all night. I mean, Marvel was its own world, even within the world of comics. Marvel was its own world, and it could be a very comfortable world. It wasn't perfect. There were a lot of weird things that went on, but overall, especially the older I get, it was this kind of cocoon. It felt like a safe place to be. You weren't going to get rich, but they hadn't had, I mean, that was why the 90s were a big shock. But Marvel had not had layoffs for decades. Between From 1957 until 1994, there was no more stable place in the world to work than Marvel Comics. So that's 67, 77, 87. For close to 40 years, you know, there had been no, you know, there might have been times when they didn't hire new people.
Mhm.
Um, so I got into this Marvel world and I was working with these characters that I had loved as a kid in a medium that not only did I still love the medium, but of course, I become familiar with underground comics. I really fell in love with Harvey Picar's body of work, with American Splendor. So comics were always in my consciousness, even if I wasn't that interested in what the Hulk was doing every month. You know, uh, the Jim Warren and then the Venice Kitchen Will Eisner material, Eisner's Contract with God. I mean, that was an incredible period for the medium. And yeah, and suddenly I'm rubbing elbows with people whose names I read in the credits: Stan, of course, and Larry, but John Romita and George Roussos and Frank Giacoia. You know, just all those people. I mean, because really they were, you know, because in comics people start so young, these guys were maybe in their 50s, you know. Um, Even Eisner, you know, who I didn't meet till years later, was, you know, you know, in his 50s. I mean, they seemed old when you're in your 20s, but really in the big picture, they were, you know, not. So I found it interesting. I rekindled an interest in the characters. To split up those stories into chapters, you had to you know, read them. You know, so I caught up on a lot of continuity. So at a certain point, actually, and one of my counterparts, the assistant editor in the British office that was in London was Neil Tennant, who you may know as one of the Pet Shop Boys.
Mhm.
So he worked there, and a guy named um, I forget who the editor maybe, well, Neil was my liaison, but then Paul Neary came to work there. Um, but eventually a guy named Des Skin, who some of you may know from Warrior magazine, he, at that point, he was the publisher of the British version of Mad magazine. He had this radical idea that maybe comics intended for consumption in England shouldn't be put together by guys from the Bronx and Brooklyn and Queens. So he came over and he convinced Marvel that he could do as good or better job. He was nice enough about it. It wasn't anything, you know, underhanded. So, but they ended up moving the British department fully to England, which is where they came up with things like Night Raven, and I think Alan Moore got his start there, and Brian Boland, a lot of people whose names you now know. So at that point, basically Sal Brodsky, who was overseeing the whole department, he was an executive and had been Stan's right-hand man and production manager in the 50s and 60s. Sal said, "Give me a date for when to pull the plug on the department." So I did what I'm sure he knew I would do, which was I probably, I padded in a couple of weeks so we could all keep getting paid, and he probably knew exactly that that's what I'd do. And then so Larry went on. Larry and I kept sharing an office. Larry was then doing the Hulk, and then eventually the Spider-Man newspaper strip that he was drawing, and sometimes I think he was even writing the Hulk sometimes. Larry is still with us, by the way. He just turned 89 and has gotten into writing novels. And I just spoke to him the other day. And so I then got a job that was, I was a shared assistant between Jim Shooter and Sal Brodsky, who were not that fond of each other. So that was an interesting position to be in. But I call it the Danny Fingeroth Memorial job. And then I was still the British liaison. And actually, because we were doing Star Wars, they were printing Star Wars at twice the rate in England. Star Wars had just come out, right? It was its first flush of hugeness. So they were actually in Star Wars Weekly, which was the British Star Wars, were using 2 issues a month. So it seemed to make sense for me to become the assistant editor on Star Wars, Archie Goodwin, which I was. But mainly that's when I did a whole line of reprint titles that I stuck my name in because Jim said I could. And so I had this potpourri job for about a year. And then in 1980, literally I guess not January 1st, because we would have been off for New Year's, but I guess January 2nd, I became Louise Jones, now Louise Simonson's assistant, when she came over from Warren Publishing.
The Star Wars Weekly stuff, we had a comic shop here in Chicago that carried some of that. And so I had been buying the regular book, but then I saw these oversized black and white things with like shorter stories, which were the same stories I knew. And I was grabbing those too. So when you were talking about all that, I knew exactly what you were talking about.
Well,
So how long were you Louise Jones / Simonson's assistant editor for?
I was her assistant, and then there were a couple of books. The tradition at Marvel always was to have the assistant also edit, some comics. I did that until early 1983. But while I was working with her, I was the editor under her supervision of Khazar, King Conan, or Conan the King, with one or two. Oh, I forget, but one or two other titles. Maybe Man Thing. And then assisted on all the editorial workload was unbelievable. We had so many titles, so many monthly titles. We had the X-Men books, the Star Trek books, the Star Wars books, the Conan books, Micronauts, Battlestar Galactica. I'm probably leaving out half of it. Just an astonishing quantity of work that not just every editorial office then had. So in early 1983, I was promoted to be the editor of the Spider-Man titles. And that was Tom DeFalco had been. He became the executive editor. And it wasn't, there were no editorial royalties, so it wasn't a matter of money or even prestige. It was just I was the next one to be promoted, and that was what came open.
So were you doing any writing at that point as well?
Yes, at that point, I had been editing, and then I became the writer of The Dazzler.
Okay.
Starting around issue 4, I was scripting it off of Tom's plots, and then plotting and scripting it off of a few of Tom's springboards. And then, Shooter had become the editor, and I was writing The Dazzler. I wrote about 20 or so issues of Dazzler, and I guess probably some other bits and pieces here and there as well.
So one of the things that I noticed about that particular era of Spider-Man, and it stretches back before that, was there was this tradition which maybe it was on purpose and maybe it wasn't, and they're not doing it anymore. But where the editor of the book would end up becoming the writer. And I believe that happened with Roger Stern. because he was editing some of the stuff. I know Denny O'Neil was editing and writing, but I think Roger Stern came in, was doing some editing, and then he became the writer. And DeFalco was doing the editing, and then he became the writer. And then you were doing the editing, and then you became the writer of Web of Spider-Man.
Right.
So, and again, I don't know if that was on purpose or not, but it was kind of an interesting thing amongst you guys. And I know and I think it ended with you.
Yeah.
No, it didn't actually, but I'll stop there. Go ahead.
Um, I think part of it is there. I mean, look, even in the, certainly in the days when royalties came in, then obviously having a Spider-Man title, uh, had a certain amount of built-in sales just because it was Spider-Man. I think, I think every case is somewhat different, but in a certain way, the bottom line is you look around and you go, well, who's an expert on Spider-Man? Who's both easy and difficult to write, right? So who's an expert on Spider-Man? Oh, Tom is. Oh, Danny, I mean, so I think that happens as much, there's a little bit of prestige. There's a lot to do with royalties when those kicked in. But I think a lot of it just has to do with who knows this character and understands the continuity and understands the powers and understands the subtleties, you know, that Peter Parker is not, a full-time depressive, morose guy. And the spider sense, while it seems magical, does have a certain logic to it. And he can lift, X amount of tons, but not Y. There's a lot that goes on, and the character is forgiving because he's so well known. Obviously, if you read through the entire 60 or whatever year run of Spider-Man, there's a million inconsistencies, but in general, there's an effort to keep it
Mhm.
consistent and believable and make, so it's a challenge because again, since it's Spider-Man, well, anybody could write Spider-Man in their sleep. Yeah, but to write Spider-Man well is very, it takes a certain kind of skill. So, but I think it may just stem from who knows this character and will make my 90% of editorial decisions have to do with somebody who is way overloaded with work trying to figure out ways to make their job and their life a little bit easier. you know I mean, within that you want to, of course, put out the best comics you can and have the best people, but a lot of it is just, how do I trim my 1,000 things I have to do today down to only 785? And if part of that is having people who you're in sync with, who understand your characters, that's a big part of the battle.
As an editor, so you just mentioned that, and I think that's really, really, really interesting. And if that was your answer to my next question, then we can move on. But I'm curious. So you did all this stuff. What would be the one thing that you can think of off the top of your head, that you picked up as an editor, that you feel helped you with what came later, or at least carried over into your writing?
Huh. Well, those are sort of, they're, uh, boy, it's going to sound corny, I guess.
Uh-huh.
I guess, well, one is more practical, one is more corny. The practical one is these things are coming out every month. And by their very nature, not every issue is going to be great,
Mhm.
but every issue has to be at least pretty good and give what we used to call a complete unit of entertainment. Um, but as I was saying about as an editor, there's a million decisions to be made, and they're not all going to be the right ones. But usually in comics, if you make a wrong decision, nobody dies. So give yourself a break and make the decision and go on to the next one and the next one and the next one and the next one. So I learned that not everything is so precious. And I think I also learned, some people may laugh at this, some people may, agree that but I learned to have compassion for people and to realize that everybody has a life to deal with and problems to deal with. And and we wished that other people were machines and that every artist would have their work in on time and every writer would have their work in on time and that it would be perfect. Um, so I think you learn a certain amount of compassion for other people and for yourself in an editorial job. So those things may seem a little contradictory, but they kind of are complementary, I think.
Yeah, I don't think they're contradictory at all. I'm curious about something. So, and if I'm wrong, if you feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. But as an editor, in your drawer someplace, there's or your proverbial drawer,
Yeah.
you have a story that's been done by somebody, and it ends up coming out as a fill-in story every once in a while, and I don't know how many of them that you guys have stacked in there, but I know that when Salicrup took over the titles, he emptied out the entire drawer
Mhm.
on the satellite books, and as a reader, it's just like, God, what is this? But I'm curious. Would you have those things? Would you kind of contract for those and then just put them away, or were they just something that you inherited, or how did that stuff work?
Oh, well, that's a whole program in itself. I mean,
Okay.
look, you're dealing with something that neither you nor the creators own. I mean, that's a big difference between working at Marvel or DC on their superheroes than say working, I don't know, at Fantagraphics on a creator-owned project. So on the one hand, it's this thing that everybody has their creative pride and ego and they want it to be the best thing ever. On the other hand, you're cutting velvet. The product's got to come out. There's got to be something on the truck and something in the store. And if there's not something on the truck and in the store, the company loses money. And if the company loses money, you lose your job. It's in
Hmm.
some ways, it's that simple. Um, so with a character, especially like Spider-Man, with 4 monthly titles, and I mean, look at its height. I don't know what it is now, but at its height, the Spider-Man group was putting out 17 titles a month that was somehow connected to Spider-Man. Um, so yeah, it would be, you'd be doing yourself a disservice, not to mention the company, not to mention the fans, if you didn't have stuff in the drawer and you make that stuff as good as it can be. But sometimes it is a tryout for a new person,
Hmm.
um, something you give to somebody who you like, who needs work. Um, yeah, and sometimes, but I mean, and sometimes you're experimenting with a different kind of storytelling, and sometimes you just want a timeless story that maybe you can slap an introductory page and a closing page in to make it fit into the current continuity. But I mean, yeah, it's just a fact of life when you're putting out so much material and you're dealing with actual humans who sometimes don't get that material in on time. You have to, you know, there's too much at stake. But I get what I sort of hear the subtext too, because that was a big difference between the comics of my childhood and the comics of the past 40 years, that they're name brand creators. So if you have a book that's based in part on a name brand creator, can you just slap something in by somebody that has the same guy wearing the same costume in it? There's arguments on both sides, but sort of the shorter answer is yes. You'd be crazy to be in that kind of position and not have a cabinet full of inventory material that you could slot in at any time.
It's funny, as I was asked that question popped in my head as we were talking, but then as I was asking it, I realized that I don't think I've seen a fill-in book for a long, long time. And I know that there's a point about a decade ago where Marvel, if they didn't have anything ready to go, they would just wait. They'd wait an extra couple weeks, even a month to publish. And I think DC was doing the same thing.
Well,
So I don't know how they're doing that anymore.
you know what else you don't see, with rare exceptions, is the same creative team on a book for 5 or 10 years. right? You see people doing shorter arcs, but I mean, but that's a big balance in the business. That's a decision that the business makes every so often. Is it more important that that creator X and Y are doing the book, or is it more important that it be that the Pavlovian response in our readers of knowing that every third week in the month they'll find a new Spider-Man title for them to buy? What's more important? And I think that's constantly being reevaluated. We're in a different world now, not just in comics. With I mean, there's a joke. A comedian, I'm blanking on his name, but I'm sure it's a regular thing comedians say about you know I want the music. What music? All the music. When? What do you mean? I want all the music done ever by anybody, and I want it on my phone, and I want it right now. Well, that's a little different world than waiting eagerly, you know, for like in my childhood, waiting for the owner of the candy store to snip the metal wire around the comics, which are already no longer in mint condition because of the metal wire. But at least waiting for him to snip the wire and put them on the stand so you can buy your next issue of Fantastic Four or Spider. So I mean, that's as much a business as a creative decision. Do we wait for this person on whom we've built this book's sales base, or do we worry that somebody's going to come into the store with their $3 or whatever, $3 or $4, and oh, Spider-Man's not there. I'm going to buy Superman. I'm going to buy this experimental thing. I'm going to buy a slice of pizza, right? I mean, you know, a lot of the business, just like streaming TV or episodic TV, it's based on repetition and people knowing it's going to be there. Um, and they're both valid. I mean, obviously, if you're looking for creator X on, even if it is a popular character, and it's been solicited that way, and that creator is not there, then are you going to come back next time, or you're just is that broken the chain? It's tough. It's tough a call to make.
I have a question about writers, real quick, and I have a theory, and I'll tell you the theory after I ask you the question.
Okay. Oh, by the way, though, just for those tuning in, did I mention that I've written a biography of Stan Lee, A Marvelous Life, and that it's available now in paperback and in audiobook, read by me? I just thought I'd mention it. Anyway, what's your next question?
Okay, so my next question has to do with writers, and then we're going to go back to your story. But do you think at what point do you mentioned while we were talking just a minute ago that writers have made, you don't see 5-year runs on things anymore, and there are some and there aren't
Right.
some, but do you think that writers experience burnout on these characters?
Sure. I think they definitely do. Um, I don't know how to elaborate on. I mean, that's just
Right.
unlike most of your questions. It's kind of that strikes me as more of a simple, kind of obvious yes or no question. Like,
Well, it is actually. So I have a theory about it,
yeah,
and it comes from reading comic books for way too long. But my theory is that a writer will have 60 issues in him, and then things start to like go down, and there are unless the person has actually created the book himself or herself, and then they can do it for as long as they want to. But I've seen it with a number of different creators, and it's really curious because there are a lot of different runs where you look at it and it's like, God, that got screwed up. Why did this team leave this book at this point, or why did this person get mad at the company and like leave and go and do Superman, or what, because look at what they left behind. But I've come to the conclusion that when something like that happens, it's probably a good thing for the book because whereas the writers have stories in them, there's a point at around issue number 60 that they've done where they just start to like coast. And have you ever found yourself as an editor in the position of watching that happen? And if so, what have you had to do about it?
Wow, that's an interesting question and theory. Uh, and I think some of it ties into the what we were talking about before, that while it's art and storytelling at a certain level, it's also a job and income. And don't forget, a lot of this is also the factor we kind of danced around, but it's the relationship between editors and create and writers and artists.
Mhm.
What happens if the editor you loved working with leaves, or the company is sold, or there's 100 different things. I mean, I always find it funny when people talk about creative endeavors as if the people doing it didn't have lives and families and health issues and live in the real world, and were impacted by politics and demographics and weather and you know, I mean, it kind of, I mean, that's what was, I mean, again, not just to plug the book, but I mean, that was sort of the fascinating thing, was to sort of see where Stan's life and career fit in the bigger picture of what was going on in the world. So I'd say the thing, I mean, as you mentioned, there was sort of a gap. There were several years where I went from being the editor of the Spider-Man books, and I was a little, I don't know if burned out was the word, but I was a little bored. It had become a little automatic for me. The books were selling well; they were coming in because I'm tight, and that's when I took a gamble and became a freelancer myself. Um, and so editors can have that too. I mean, I don't know what I don't know. You've stumped me a little because I don't know if I ever comics is sort of right. I come from an era where comics were only read for a couple of years by kids.
Mhm.
And a lot of those comics were done by rote and by people who were clearly not especially interested and sold millions of copies. you know, because they had Superman or Batman, you know, um, in them. And then eventually they didn't. The audience changed and what the audience demanded. So, I mean, I think I came across that problem more with myself as an editor, and I decided I wanted to explore some different things and take a chance. And that's that first time when I went freelance. Then I had some freelance years that had their ups and downs. They were interesting. I had some more lucrative and less lucrative years.
Mhm.
And because of that, and because of some things going on in my personal life, I'd always had a standing offer from both Shooter and DeFalco to come back on staff. I never thought I'd see the Spider-Man books again, and then it ended up I did, because I think because Tom had liked the way I'd handled the character as an editor. Um, and by that point, I found ways to make the job more interesting for myself. I kind of learned sort of that what had led me to sort of the ennui, as it were, was a shallower perception on my part of what the job entailed and what the character and what the Marvel characters were about and could be, which I learned while I was a freelancer and sort of explored the characters and literally the idea of what a story was, and done some growing up, and had things happen in my life. Um, so I don't know if I ever addressed that. It seemed there would always be some bump in the road that would happen before, in my personal experience, there was an opportunity. I would say there are times when a new editor comes on a book, so when you inherited a series,
Mhm.
there's a relationship that the previous editor had with the previous creative team that has a lot to do with the chemistry of the book. And you're this stranger walking in, and sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't. Um, So that's been more my experience, to be on one end or the other or something like that, which is sort of the opposite. Part of it is, so the old team has a way they've worked with the previous editor, but the previous editor has a different set of priorities than you do, just because he's a different person. So things that, I mean, there was an edit, I followed one editor on one book. I don't want to mention any of them. Maybe people can figure it out, and it'll seem like ridiculous. The previous editor had not made his writer put numbers on the pages, and that drove me crazy. It's like, you have a computer, it has a function, you can put numbers on the pages, so if the pages fall off my desk, and you put your name on them too. I mean, you don't have, it couldn't be easier. Buy a rubber stamp or set your word processor to do, and the guy wouldn't do it and wouldn't do it and wouldn't. And it just struck me as like, well, that's really weird, because the previous editor I know had been very demanding about some, comparatively things that were in my eyes comparatively petty or irrelevant. But this thing, which I thought was, no, it doesn't affect the creativity of the book, but it's like a sign of respect for the guy in the desk. Please put numbers on the pages. No. Okay. What am I supposed to do with that? I know that sounds so stupid and inane, but that's the kind of thing that can drive you crazy at work, right? I mean, the person next to you who won't stop tapping their foot, or who has to bang their elbow on your head every time they go to the bathroom unintentional or intent. It's so there's the part of it that makes it, so that's sort of an indirect way of answering. So yeah, I never got to the point. Oh, so there may be a point you come in, and the chemistry. I was just trying to be funny, I guess, to make it. But somebody comes in, they disrupt that flow, and that's that bump in the road that makes them feel they have to leave, or that you feel you have to get rid of them. Even though it would seem like petty things. I mean, look, the thing that's funny, haha, not haha funny, but there are people who think I'm the best editor they ever had. There are people who think I'm the worst editor they ever had. I'm the same guy. Clearly, there's something about the relationship and the chemistry of those relationships that makes horse racing, whatever you want to call it. So, I get what you're saying. Whoa, what happened? Hello, you still there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you see me?
Weird. Okay, okay, some bizarre thing just happened with my computer. Okay, good. Firefox has decided to open up for no good reason. Anyway, so that 5-year thing, you're probably right. But I think before that 5 years, I don't think there are many 5-year runs, unless you're talking about Kurt Swan on Superman, maybe. I mean, look, the most famous one, I guess, is Claremont all those years on X-Men. But I don't think anything comes even close to that. Who else? Are there any others? Who else has done 5 years?
Yeah, there's a lot of things I can think of, but they're the ones I have in mind, so I don't want to say anything.
Okay, all right.
But yeah, there's a number of people.
Obviously, Stan and Jack on.
Yeah, they don't count because they created. I mean, if you create the character, I think that it doesn't count. I think if you're working on the character, for example, DeFalco and Friends on Spider-Girl, that was fine. They could have done that until the cows came home, because they essentially created the character, even though it tied in with. But if you're coming on and let's say you're doing Wolverine, and you have like 60 stories in you, and then you hit 61, and then all of a sudden it starts going downhill. That's what I was thinking of. But you were talking about being on both sides of an issue, where you're dealing with an editor is, or you are the editor dealing with it. So I'd like to ask you a question, and it might be a little personal. How do you deal with that adversity? So you've got an issue, okay, and whatever the issue is, all of a sudden things aren't going to be the same anymore. And I'm going to equate this, and I'm going to take it out of any of the any of the stuff that you personally dealt with, and I'm going to take it and say that there is an artist out there someplace who doesn't get along with the writer, and then the writer says, "Hey, get rid of this guy," and all of a sudden he doesn't have a job anymore, or he can't get work, or whatever. So, and there are people out there who deal with that, and especially with creative people, creative people end up being a little bit their emotions are on their sleeves in a lot of different ways. Whether you're a writer or an artist, it's
Oh,
there. And I call it the crazy artist gene. And it kind of permeates through creativity one way or another. So how do you deal with an adverse situation? Without saying, oh, hey, how, was it something where it's like, this happened to me before, and now I'm going to handle it this way, or I'm going to move on? And the reason I'm asking you specifically that is you've had a whole bunch of different things. And as we were talking before we started streaming, the comic book industry is something that's almost like Hollywood, where you're working in it for a little while, and then it's like, okay, well, we're tired of this. We're tired of Jack Kirby. He can be relegated doing covers here and there, and we're going to bring in like John Byrne and do that, as an example. So how do you deal with stuff like that? Because you've had a career where you're now basically a comic book historian, and you're doing all kinds of different things with that, and not everybody gets to do that. And my assumption is it's you who've been able to do that. It wasn't circumstances that just fell in your lap. One day maybe you didn't say, "Oh, I'm going to go off and do this now," and the opportunity certainly came to you. But how did you get yourself in the mindset to where you were able to do that as a creative person?
it's really hard. I mean, it's because people who, I don't know if it's like in other businesses, but in comics, if you're going to have a staff job, if you say to yourself, I don't want to be a freelancer, that's too insecure. I'm going to sit home and eat brownies all day. That won't be good. I need a 9 to 5 job with benefits. Uh, Most people in comics with those kinds of jobs don't like confrontation. They're
Mhm.
essentially creative people. They like being at home in the world in their heads, whether it's their own creations or Marvel's or DC's creations. We like being in that fantasy world. But when you have an actual 9 to 5 job and you're a writer, editor is about the only thing there is, unless you're gifted in some way as an executive, which some people are, but so you're a person who hates confrontation. There's a few people who love confrontation, right? You know who they are. They're editors who love to fight. Most people in comics don't. They're not in love with conflict. When I said the thing about that insular world of comics and of Marvel, that's part of the appeal. It's
Mhm.
like, man, oh man, I'm maybe not be making a lot of money, although sometimes we did. May not be making a lot of money, but I don't have to deal with with that horrible stuff that people who hate their jobs have to deal with every day of their lives, no matter how much money they make or don't make. And then something disrupts that, right? There's a decision that has to be made. There's an artist and writer feuding. There's an editor who seems to have it in for you, or a freelancer who says shitty things about you in the press. And how do you then go work with that person the next day? And it's not. I don't know. I hope somebody tells me you just do it. You take it on a case by case basis. A lot of it has to do, like, oh, look, the reason that shows about workplaces are so popular is because the workplace becomes your surrogate family for both good and bad. I mean that's essentially what every police procedural is, and every sitcom is about this, either a real family or a de facto family, and how they get along. And I think a lot of us bring to the workplace, however we dealt with things in our families, that's where that conflict comes in. So I don't know, you come in as an editor on a book that's selling pretty well, and yet you don't get along with that creator. Well, I mean, that's where the power equation comes in. As the freelancer, you either do what the editor says or you leave. And as the editor, you either try to work with the freelancer or you fire them, which is never pleasant. Um, Personally, my own tactic, certainly, uh, you said this may get personal. I was once referred to in a Ray's review by Tom DeFalco as an editorial pit bull.
Okay.
So in other words, I'm not generally a yeller. Once in a while, I'll break and I'll yell. I'm not a yeller. I'm not a door slammer. I'm not a demander. But I will wear you down. And eventually, to save your own sanity, you'll leave. You know? I'm not totally bragging about that, but I mean that just seems to be, because it's very hard to just say to somebody, this thing you've been making $250,000 a year from, it's over. It's very hard to do that. Um, but sometimes, so I mean, but it clearly, if you're working with people who you don't mesh with, I mean, I prefer to look at the other side when you're working with people you do mesh with, and who when you criticize them, don't take it as an attack on their lives and their very core, but take it as one professional to another, and they go, oh, I see why you may not like that thing. Here's a good way to make it work. You know what I mean? So when I find people like that, and who actually find working with me inspiring and enjoyable, then you try to stick with them as long as you can. Look, and so a lot of it is about people skills. I mean, those years I spent as a freelancer, I learned a lot about. I had this sort of fantasy view of what being a full-time freelancer was,
Mhm.
that was shattered. Oh, I don't know, after about 2 days. When I ended up working as a writer for an editor who I think felt pressured to take me on as a writer, and we had a horrible relationship. It was a nightmare. But ultimately he had the power. Although ultimately he got fired. Um, and yes, I did run up and down the halls and click my heels when that happened. But I mean, so it does come down. That's why people like working on creator-owned things, even if they don't make much money. If you own this thing, and kids, be careful what contracts you sign, because you may technically own something, but if you cede control to somebody, then that's as if you didn't own it. But that's why you know that's why Stan back in the 70s partnered up with Dennis Kitchen. They did a kind of an underground style comic called Comics Book,
Mhm.
that they just put out a few years ago, a anthology of it, and that really stirred up a lot of trouble at Marvel, because they were paying the underground cartoonists a page rate, and then also letting them own their work, which none of the Marvel artists and writers could do. And that's one of the reasons they discontinued the book. It didn't sell very well, but also it just stirred up a lot of discontent, as it should have, in the offices. So I don't even remember what your question was, but I hope I've answered it to some degree.
Yes, you did. So I want to make a real quick commentary. I've been reading Spider-Man since 1984, and I will say that the two tenures you had on that character as an editor, I thought were both fantastic.
Well, thank you.
And I know you ended your second run in the middle of the Clone Saga, and I love that story, and I'm not going to go into that because this is how often do I get to talk to you, but I really enjoyed that story, and I like the stuff from the 80s as
Well, thank
well.
you.
And I figured that's after hitting you with a tough question, I should probably like say something, but it's true. So you stopped being the editor of Spider-Man. Was that the end of you editing at Marvel as well?
You mean in the 90s?
Yeah.
Yeah, that Marvel, that there was a restructuring then. It was part of that what they came to call the Marvolution.
All right.
And if you've never been through a corporate restructuring, I do not wish it on anybody. It was really traumatic for most of us involved, because it was this shakeup that had little or nothing to do with how you were actually performing your job or how the comics were. It had to do with corporate machinations at a level that that both Shooter and DeFalco had protected us from. And so they just wanted us to be able to make comics. And so most of us were a little naive when it came to the ways of the world. We were in that Marvel cocoon. Do good work, put your books out on time, you're golden. Well, suddenly that changed overnight in a way that outside of, a death in the family or the end of a marriage or other relationship, none of us had ever experienced. Suddenly the real world intruded on our fantasy world there in the Marvel bullpen. And I landed in a place, on paper it looked good, or neutral, but I landed in what was actually a not very good place, even though my title and my salary stayed the same. And in theory, nothing had changed. Everything had changed.
Mhm.
Ironically, of course, the Clone Saga was considered one of the gems of the company at the time. That was, as well it should have. But history has been unkind um, to the clone. Sorry,
Oh, that's all right.
my phone. No, whether I wanted to or not, my phone and my computer are linked inextricably. No matter how many times I try to not have it be that way. So I was offered a job by a guy named Byron Price, who was a well-known publisher and packager, and he was starting a online venture that was so new. It was called Virtual Comics, and he offered me to come over and be the vice president and head of editorial and come up with these new characters and bring my friends from Marvel over as freelancers and some of staffers too. And I was so, even though I'd been at Marvel for 18 years and thought I'd, again, since there was a track record of no mass layoffs for close to 40 years. So I was not laid off. I mean, people sort of lumped me in with that group of people who were, and a lot of them are talented people, so it would be no shame. But actually, I left on my own steam. The company did make it as unpleasant as possible for me to be, so it was not that hard a decision. And so I went to work for Byron, inventing internet comics, and that sort of began the current journey that I'm on.
The third act.
The third, well, I guess, guess depends how long, how many more, I don't know how many more acts there'll be, but somewhere, yeah, or at least late in the second act.
Okay. So talk about the stuff the right now stuff you were doing.
Well, I worked for Byron, and that was an experimental venture. I mean, he paid me well. I got to do a lot of cool stuff. He knew a lot of interesting people. I mean, it was very good training because a lot of stuff at Marvel that had been compartmentalized. Oh, we have this department to handle promotions, and this to handle sales, and this to handle public relations, and this to handle. Suddenly, I was doing it. Me and a small core of other people were doing everything. But it was an experimental venture that in the first big era of internet, first internet boom of the mid '90s. And when that ran out of money, I had some other jobs and went over then to a company called Visionary Media that did something called World Girl, which was on Showtime's website. I worked with a lot of very interesting people there. David B. Williams, the founder of the company. Glenn Ginsberg, who'd been at Marvel, was there, and Buzz Potemkin, who was a legend in the animation business, was running things over there. Look him up. He died a couple of years ago, but he was incredible. He ran Hanna-Barbera for a long time. But that also was a VC funded experimental venture that, it had a pretty simple business plan. We'll make short cartoons, we'll make short animations as pilots. If you like them, buy them from us, but it got caught up in that internet undertow. So I really had to figure out what to do. I had all this experience, these sort of esoteric skills. I knew all these people. And so one of the things I did was I saw that my old partner from Darkhawk, Mike Manley, because I wrote Darkhawk for its whole run at Marvel and Deadly Foes of Spider-Man, a bunch of other stuff, while I was on staff. And so Manley was doing this magazine called Draw, for tomorrows. And so I said, well, I wonder if anybody would want a magazine about writing. So I called up John Morrow or emailed him, and he had been thinking about the along similar lines at the same time. So that is where Right Now magazine came from. And that what I bring to everything related to comics that I do is someone who worked in the business making comics as an editor and a writer, coming up with characters, coming up with stories, and I know how the sausage is made.
Mhm.
So I think I brought that to Right Now, formerly called Danny Fingeroth's Right Now, and it was like Writer's Digest for comics and animation too, and a little bit of science fiction, mainly comics, of course. So I did what you're doing, in-depth interviews with people,
Mhm.
where I wouldn't let them get away with surface answers. I kind of politely forced them to peel back the onion and go back to where they really. Because when somebody said, you say to somebody, "Where did you start?" And they say, "Well, I was having lunch with John Byrne one day," and you go, "How did you get to have lunch with John Byrne?" Wait, walk me back those steps. Once you're having lunch with John Byrne, you've got a lot of potential things you could do. But how did you get to be from outside the bubble to look at? So I did a lot of interviews like that with people and published a lot of how-tos and that at the same time I was doing a lot of teaching in New York and some online. I taught at the New School and at NYU's Adult Ed department. And then I became involved with Karen Green and Jeremy Dauber and a lot of people at Columbia University because they were doing a lot of. Karen is Columbia's and maybe anybody's one of the first comic book librarians in the world. And all these things sort of came together. The old Museum of Comic and Cartoon Art, I did a lot with them. I was a hustling freelancer looking to do anything and everything. And my interest and my skill set and my experience all were from the world of comics. And I mean, I've made a big effort to expand from just Marvel superheroes to all sorts of comics and graphic novels. I was a vaudevillian for Wizard World for about 4 years, and although they're known obviously for their mainstream superhero stuff, they let me do a lot of oddball stuff. Any city we went to, I found whoever the comics academics and the independent creators were there, including, well, Chicago. If you've been to the Chicago cons, I mean, those were my marathons because there's such a richness of talent in and around Chicago. I sort of had it wasn't called that, but it was in effect the Danny Fingeroth slate of panels. So like in Minneapolis, I did my Bob Dylan and comics and my Prince and comics panel. In Louisville, I did my comics and baseball panel, and I got the curator of the Louisville Slugger Museum, who knew there was such a thing, to come and do a panel about baseball and comics. So, but in Chicago, I would be doing like 16 panels over 4 days, which was crazy. But I certainly was not bored at those conventions. It was, so it's been this very interesting hustle, but a hustle of trying to take all these skills I have and experience and make it into a thing, So I don't know if that I know that might be a more compressed answer, but a lot of that started with Byron Price
Mhm.
and Visionary Media and continued into Right Now.
Well, I had mentioned before we started that you're like the modern age Roy Thomas, where you started out as a fan and writing letters. And I didn't ask you if you wrote letters, but I'm
I think that's you see. I think I think Roy Thomas is the modern age Roy Thomas, as I mentioned to you before.
right. And you
Roy's
did.
still kicking and active, Um, but I was not a capital F fan, huh?
I said that was meant as a compliment.
Thank you. No, I didn't, and I didn't. I took it as a compliment. I
Okay.
didn't want people, but I mean, I just didn't want people to think that Roy is not still active. He is. Oh no, I very much took it as a compliment. But I
Okay.
was not. I was a capital F fan in the sense that I had a passion for
Mhm.
comic books as a kid and as a teenager. But I went. It's funny. I was being interviewed by Scott Edelman for his Eating the Fantastic
Mhm.
podcast, which is a terrific podcast. And Scott and I, of course, worked together at Marvel for a while when he was there, and became friends and have, and are friends. Um, and Scott has a different origin story. Scott went to the 1970 Phil Sewling convention in New York as a capital F fan, having been corresponding with people, and that has really blossomed into even more of him being a capital F fan and eventually a professional. I went to the 1970 Phil Sewling convention and said to myself, "Oh, that was great. Now I never have to do that again."
Okay.
Glad I did it. Out of the way, off the bucket list. Obviously I did not know where life would take me after that, and that I would literally be going to a different convention every week. And again, I came to appreciate it more because what I just saw was a very surface, but I was not. I wrote 1 or 2 letters and never had any printed, as brilliant as I'm sure they were. I think they were too long. I always decided like once every 6 months I would write Stan a letter because he urgently needed to know my opinion on every single Marvel comic for the past 6 months. I did go to visit the offices of my friend David Sable when we were 12, and we did get stopped by Flo Steinberg from getting in to meet Stan. Again, I've forgotten. So was there a question at the end of that?
No, I actually, I'm.
Oh, you're complimenting me. So
Yes, I did. How much do you think? How much do you think boldness has contributed to what you've been able to achieve?
well, I like to think of myself as more brave than bold, but
Okay.
no, I don't know. I think stupidity is a better term for it.
Okay. Well, that works too.
Just like uh, just a complete ignorance and unmindfulness of consequences, or much of what people refer to as the real world. Boldness, I don't know, I guess. Can you, I mean, again, I will take that as a compliment, but I mean, what do you mean by boldness?
Well, one of the things that I found as I've been speaking to people is when somebody goes to do something, what a lot of people tend to do, and whether it's like the cosplayers or the artists or even the modern day editors, they take this stuff and it's like they, for lack of a better way to put it, they put it inside of them. It becomes a part of them, and then they go out with it. And for example, when the first interview I did with Heather Antos, who is she was an editor at Marvel up to a couple of years ago, and she's doing stuff at Valiant, and she had never read a comic book up until like 24 2013 or something like that. But she started reaching out to editors on Twitter. And so it was just that mere act of like reaching out, and then a year later she was working at Marvel as an assistant editor. And there's been a lot of stretching out of people where you mentioned that you had gone to the convention and you were just like, okay, well, that's off my bucket list. Whereas the other person who went was just like moving forward with it. So I was curious. You mentioned you saying stupidity having something to do with it, and I know that was a joke, but I think sometimes we act in certain ways that aren't necessarily the logical thing to do, but we do them anyway. And I was thinking that more as a boldness type of thing. So does that make sense?
Yeah, and I mean, I think it does go back to what Tom DeFalco's observation about Peter Parker, that he has a dozen different reasons that he claims is why he became and continues to be Spider-Man. I mean, I think what humans tend to do is you look back at what you've done and the events in your life, and you impose a narrative on them. I mean, the fact is, if I had taken that restaurant job, or if I had a different kind of mother who pressured me to go to law school or something, which she didn't, although she would have been happy to pay for it if I had decided to, maybe I'd be sitting here talking to somebody else, looking back and going, "Oh yes, the law was my first love, and it was just a matter of getting that push from my mom that made me realize that, or some, you know." So I think I think it was pretty clear from decisions I made at every juncture in my life that I was going to opt to do something creative
Mhm.
with my time. Whether that would be a hobby or whether it would be how I spent the majority of my time, I think is where sometimes circumstances come in. So I guess it was, boy, it's so, I mean, I look back and yes, I guess in some ways the easier thing might have been to say, "Hey, mom, I appreciate that offer. I am going to go to law school, but I'd probably be dead today if I did that." I mean, I just, um, I think, at one point, I guess when I fell in love with film, which is why I went to film school, um, and like I think like a lot of people of my generation and of that age, I kind of um, idealized Orson Welles and Robert Altman, and but again, I see I'm probably I don't know if I would have made a great movie director. Maybe I think now I'd be pretty good. I think when I was 22, I don't think I would have been. Although I did make films in college, but they were kind of me and like two, either alone or with two or three other people. So I kind of, I guess the boldness, if you can call it that, and again, that's where a lot of my own particular family circumstances came in, and kind of, I mean, I don't know, if I'd had a situation where my mother and father sat me down, at the dining room table one night and said, "You can do what you like, but you know, we'll pay for everything if you go to law school or dental school." Not there's anything wrong with any of those things. Some of my best friends and relatives are lawyers, dentists, doctors, and thank God for them because they've kept me alive, But um, if my parents had sat me down and gave me that ultimatum and said, if you go to law school, we'll pay for everything, and if you go to film school or go to work in publishing, you're on your own. I don't know, but that didn't happen, and
Mhm.
people respected or admired or tolerated what I decided to do at various points when even I didn't know what I was doing. So was it bold? I mean, thank you. I'll take the compliment. But so I think again, like a lot of people, I think depending on what mood I'm in, it was either stupid, brilliant, bold, cowardly. That's look. Maybe that's why I've gravitated, and people who are in comics, including yourself, have gravitated towards storytelling because the story, you know, as we have found out all too well in recent history, the storytellers control reality, and reality is in many ways a battle for who tells the better story,
Mhm.
So that may be bold and arrogant to say, but say talking in my book about Stan Lee as a guy who told stories and told a lot of different. I mean, I don't know if I'm right or wrong. I try to give an even-handed view in this book about Stan and what he did or didn't do, but I'm aware that for every story I told in here, there are 10 others I could have, and 10 other ways I could have directed the story. Nonfiction, nonfiction is a fiction,
Mhm.
That, that's the reason there's more than one biography of anybody, right?
Mhm.
So I'll thank you for the compliment. When I'm in the depths of despair, struggling for an idea, and whatever else, I will remember your kind words.
You'll go to YouTube and find the interview and be like, okay, what
Exactly
did you say?
right.
Talk a little bit about the Talent Talk Live you're doing on Monday.
Monday night, there's a relatively new company called. I think there's a lot of companies would use the words talent. This is Talent Talk Live, and I guess if you, especially if you look for that name or just look for Talent Talk Live, Danny Fingeroth, Monday night, December 14th at 8 o'clock Eastern, I'm giving a talk about this book and about Stan Lee, and it's a little different. So it's limited to 20 people, and you'll have the opportunity to buy a copy of the book, autographed, personalized and autographed. and sent to you. It's on, it's online, and it'll be live and interactive. So a lot of my presentations, I'll read an excerpt from the book. I'll do a PowerPoint thing about Stan's life and career, and we'll take questions at the end. Very often it'll be questions that people will text in, and those are great, and I'm doing more of them, so please. But this particular one, since Talent Talk has people like Howard Chaykin talking about drawing and comic page design, and Mark Wade talking about comics writing, and a few other people, and it's not just comics. They're have experts in different areas. I'm going to have a session about Stan Lee's life and career, about which I know there's much controversy. So as I say in the promotional text, well, I just did a video that you can find on their website. But in the video, I say, it's a chance to ask all the tough questions about Stan Lee, all the doubts and controversies surrounding him that you may want to talk about. I am happy to talk about those. And if you want to talk about the Clone Saga, that's fine too. It's your money. So that's basically what I said in the video. But the idea is, it's kind of like when you go to a convention and you get one of those small sessions with a creator. So that's what Talent Talk specializes in, as opposed to some other things I may be doing. There's also a website called Comixplex, COMIXPLEX, that I'll be very involved with in the coming year. Nothing official yet, but although I was on I actually was a guest on an interview show, but I'll be doing a bunch of things with them. But Monday night, if you want a chance to either tell me a great story about Stan, or to tell me some terrible thing you heard about him, or what, but I mean, it's really going to be, almost as intimate as this. It'll, like I said, a limit of 20 people, and in any group of 20 people, not everybody wants to talk, even if they're given the opportunity. So that's coming up Monday night, and it'll be a bold journey into, as so many of these Zoom things are. It's like working without a net. My Tourette's might suddenly kick in. Hope I haven't offended anybody with Tourette's. I don't really have it, luckily, as far as I know. Maybe I don't know. Maybe I just demonstrated I do. So that's what that's going to be.
So is that the 14th?
That's the 14th, December 14th.
Okay, so that's December 14th for anyone who finds us in August. You've missed it, but
I think it'll be archived at the Talent Talk Live.
Okay, that helps too. So you're also doing Will Eisner Week, and we were talking a little bit earlier, and you said that you had met him. At what point in your career did you meet him?
Let me for anybody who's actually been listening for these 2+ hours, and I thank you for your time. Will Eisner Week, I am the chair of Will Eisner Week, which means, so you said I do it in New York. Will Eisner Week is all over the world. I personally do events in New York because I'm in New York, but my job, much like as an editor, my job is to nag and cajole people all over the world to do events, up until COVID, in person, in bookstores, in comic shops, at universities, at schools, in their living room, relating not just to Will Eisner, but to the graphic novel, to Will's ideals of free speech and inclusivity, and comics as art and comics as literature. So I work with Carl and Nancy Grapper, who are the people who run the Will and Ann Eisner Foundation. And we just lost Ann Eisner last month, Will's wife, and the Will Eisner Studios. So they're sort of Eisner Central, and I have helped them take Will Eisner Week from a celebration at 1 or 2 venues about 10 years ago to over 100 venues, both real and virtual, across the world. This year, and if you'd like to do something for Will Eisner Week, or contact me at all, Danny at DannyFingeroth.com, and I'm very active on Facebook and to some degree on Twitter. But Will Eisner Week, we realize that because of the COVID, people have other things they may focus on besides Will Eisner Week, or even if they want to do something, they can't do it in a large group. So we're in the process of creating now material from the Will Eisner website that you can use all or part of to supplement your event or instead of your event. And it's very, unfortunate. The reason is unfortunate, but what we're doing is very exciting. And putting together people like Dennis Kitchen, Gene Luen Yang, who people know for his American-Born Chinese and Superman versus the Klan and a million other things. Dennis Kitchen, Paul Levitt, a lot of people are involved. So we hope, and Will Eisner Week is celebrated in March it's the first week in March, although we're quite flexible. Will's birthday was March 6th. So we sort of focus it around that period, but certainly over the years, we've had stuff in February, we even had stuff in April, but generally we try to keep it to the first week in March. I didn't know Eisner. Well, I met him. Well, it's funny. I met him on the bus in San Diego, on the shuttle bus one year. And then when I worked for Byron Price, I told you, Byron knew a lot of interesting people, including Will Eisner. And Will was doing some projects, including something called the Spirit Screensaver, which if you have it, is a real collector's item. And it's got these interesting snippets of interviews with Will and images from the Spirit. And so at San Diego one year, I guess it was maybe 95, Will came over to the Byron Price table to promote it. And I was sitting with him. And it's very funny. Comics fame is a funny thing. Being a movie star or being a politician, people know you. When you're comic book famous, it's actually a good kind of fame because you don't have to have bodyguards unless you're at a convention. So, it's like Stan Lee at the Marvel table or Stan Lee at a panel mobbed by thousands of people. Stan Lee eating breakfast at the hotel is not mobbed by thousands of people. So Will Eisner similarly. Will was walking through the con, he'd be deluged by people. But Will sitting at the table of a small publisher, kind of people would just walk by and go, "Oh, that can't be Will Eisner sitting at the Byron Price table," Right? So I literally stood on a chair feeling like an idiot going, "Meet Will Eisner," which seemed, I think these people can go, "Why would Will Eisner be there?" But so those are the times I met him. But I do a lot of lecturing and presentations, and one is about Will and his career and work. And Carl and Nancy found out about that, and they hired me to help them expand Will Eisner Week. And I've been doing it for over 10 years. And I say, and Will is somebody that people generally, even people who may not have liked him personally, and there were not that many, but nobody's going to be liked by everybody. And Will was a kind of driven, passionate guy. I don't think anybody denies Will's achievements, accomplishments, and talent. That certainly. So he's somebody who's universally admired, revered, and that comes through. But he's also somebody who died, 15 years ago. And although it's like any pioneer, although there are people who, whether they know it or not, owe him their careers, in the sense that there's now a market for independent comics and for graphic novels and for personal memoir. There's a whole, I think everything we have in the modern graphic novel and a large part of the modern comic book goes back in some way to Will Eisner, even if people don't know his name. And part of the raison d'etre of Will Eisner Week is so that this really vital, important figure is not forgotten, nor is his work forgotten. But as important as himself and his work is his legacy of the graphic novel and of what he calls sequential art. So that's what I'm able to play a small part in. But that's what Will Eisner Week is about. And again, you don't need, a tap on the head from our sword to do a Will Eisner Week event. We'd love it if anybody does them in person or online or on the radio. And it would be appreciated if you did let us know about it, because we can help promote it. And, then next year I can say we had 200 events and I get the bragging rights. But the idea is, to spread the word about comics, about Will and his legacy.
That's really awesome. I love his work so much. And I was able to, he was doing a talk with Neil Gaiman here in Chicago in 2002, I want to say. And it was at Chicago Cultural Center, or no, Chicago, the Harold Washington Library downtown. And it was funny because they gave this talk, and I unfortunately can't remember almost anything they said, but I wasn't as familiar with Neil Gaiman at the time.
Uh-huh.
And I won't go into that, but it was funny because afterwards there is a line like around the block for Neil Gaiman and nobody for Will Eisner. And so I was really excited because I wasn't there for Gaiman. I was there for Eisner. So I was able to go over and talk to him for a couple minutes. I had him sign something, which is up on my wall. And, and it was a really great moment.
Yeah, no, a lot of it is context. If you put the right person in the wrong context,
Mhm.
I've seen that happen at comic conventions where people who, you know, at an indie show would be swamped at like a mainstream show or not, or somebody. Yeah, a lot of it depends on where you put. Then of course there were the Eisner Awards,
Right.
but it's almost like the Oscars. A lot of people don't even they just go. It's sort of like they don't even know why it's called the Eisner Awards, or they have some idea there was some guy
Hmm.
named Will Eisner. And again, to go back to this, Eisner and Stan had a fascinating relationship that I talk about in here. They both went to DeWitt Clinton High School, as did many other comic luminaries, and they, it's a very complicated, but I think mutually respectful and admiring relationship, even though Eisner had no interest in superheroes. You can read about it there. Um, and so that's Will Eisner week, and that was my relationship with Will. I mean, it's sort of, I'm working now. I've been working for several years and trying to find a home for a graphic novel about the life of Jack Ruby, who was the guy who killed Lee Harvey Oswald, who nobody knows anything about, who had this crazy life. And Rick Geary and I have been working on a graphic novel. Rick Geary, who's an independent cartoonist whose work so if anybody would like to hear a pitch for a Jack Ruby graphic novel by me and Rick, I'm all ears, because uh, it's I've had a lot of interest in it, but like everything in comics, getting someone to, well, maybe pull the trigger is not the right term in this context, but getting somebody to agree to pay money for it. So we may be doing a Kickstarter soon, so be on the lookout for that.
That sounds great. And then, so is there anything else you'd like to tell people before we?
Um, that's those are the main things. There may be a Bob Dylan related project, because that's another one of my obsessions coming soon. Dylan is turning 80. Just got the Nobel Prize a few years ago. Just had his catalog sold for 300 or $400 million. So I think there's interest in Bob Dylan. So I don't know if it'll be a graphic novel. It may be, now that I'm, I mean, aside from this book, I've done several other nonfiction books. So I'd like to keep active in that area. Um, and I may also be bringing back Superman on the Couch disguised as Clark Kent. The rights to those have reverted. But Will Eisner Week and the paperback of the Stan book, which has just come out. If people are interested in autographed copies, they can contact me, and we can make some kind of deal for me to get them to you. Um, and I think that's all I can think of to promote and to remind people about. When things happen, I don't keep them secret. Facebook is probably the best place to find things Danny Fingeroth related. And yeah, I think you've asked everything that can possibly be asked. Well, maybe.
Oh, no, I've got a whole lot of.
That's true. It's only been 2 hours and 2.5 hours.
That's right. Well, my cat keeps stalking me. He usually eats 24 minutes ago, so he's like
Okay,
right
well,
there waiting.
you have to have our priorities.
Oh yes, yes. So I think that we will end it there. Thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It was great fun. Great questions. I really, I appreciate it when somebody puts thought into questions and actually, knows background to inform those questions. So thank you, and thanks for the time.
You're very welcome. That a lot of that was all organic, just from spending years reading your edited comics.
And quit stalking me.
Sorry. So, and then again, for anybody who is interested in reading my book, Visitations, all you have to do is email me at the email down below here, or email me at visitationscomicbook@gmail.com, and I'll send you a free PDF of it. And so we're gonna sign off there. Do you want to say goodbye so everyone can see you again?
I will. Okay, goodbye. Thanks, everybody. Stay well, stay safe, stay healthy, and see you next time.